Welcome back to Art Appreciation, everyone. Once again, continuing our discussion of various artistic mediums. Today, we'll be looking at sculpture and craft medium, as opposed to, say, mechanical forms like photography or printmaking. So, jumping right in. Sculpture refers to a work of art in three dimensions with height, breadth, and depth, thus existing in space. So, unlike all the other art forms that we've talked about so far, which are all two-dimensional, now we'll be talking about more three-dimensional kinds of works. So, sculpture, like drawing and painting, very, very old, dates all the way back to the Paleolithic period. In fact, some of the earliest artworks that we know of are all, examples of sculpture, as opposed to, say, like cave drawings or cave paintings. But here we can see one of the earliest known male figure, or humanoid figures, I should say. And this is the lion-headed man, which was found in Holstedt-Stadel, Germany, and dated between 35 and 40,000 BCE. And but once again, it shows that early people are not only creating drawings and things in their dwelling places, but they're also creating objects which serve some kind of purpose within their society. And so it's not really well known or known exactly what this would have served originally in terms of its purpose. However, it is thought to have been some kind of quasi shamanistic like ritual object or something like that, because it does create an anthropomorphic kind of view of a half human, half lion-like figure. So it probably was worked into some kind of shamanic religious type of practice or something along those lines. But once again, it also harkens to the idea of man's existence within nature and all of these kinds of principles. So, but just a nice example and illustration of just how old sculpture really is. Now, sculpture can take many kinds of forms, but the majority of sculpture that you're ever going to see and that you're probably familiar with is what's known as a freestanding sculpture. And so this is sculpture that's meant to be seen from all sides. And so here we can see Michelangelo's sculpture of the David. And excuse me, we'll talk more about the David in particular when we get to the Renaissance, but this is a nice example of freestanding sculpture, in that it is located in a public place. It's situated on top of a pediment so that we would actually be able to walk all around it. This is actually a very large sculpture. I believe he's like 10 to 12 feet tall, and it's also situated on top of this very large kind of stand. So we would actually never be able to see it from right on. We would actually always be able to only be able to look up at it. But we would be able to ambulate all around and view it from all sides. So this is what makes it considered to be freestanding. However, there are multiple kinds of freestanding sculpture, and they are, present all over the world, no matter what time, what place, what culture we're talking about. Here we can see some of the more famous examples of freestanding sculpture. These are the Moai of Easter Island, and once again, we'll get more into these when we talk about Pacific Islander art, but these are some of the more interesting sculptures from Polynesian culture, in that they are the largest examples of Polynesian culture. They are all freestanding, and these are also sculptures that the creation of which brought about the ecological destruction of the Easter Island civilization. So, and we'll get more into that later on as well, but kind of an interesting aspect of that as well. But we even have more contemporary examples of sculptures. One of my favorite contemporary sculptors, Ron Mueck, and they had a retrospective of his at the Fort Worth Modern about a year or two ago. But he's very hyper realistic. In fact, if you go and see any of his freestanding or any of his sculptures in general, every single individual hair on these people's heads are placed. He's using actual materials, so they look like they could just come to life at you. And but what I find interesting about Ron Mueck's work is that he really plays with our perception of reality through the use of things like scale. So here we have a figure of a mother and a child, and but this is about half of life size. versus, say, some of his other work where he's really playing up this monumental quality within the human form. But once again, works like this, even though we know it's not real because of its height, it looks like it could just come alive because every individual hair is actually placed individually in the head, on arms and all that. The skin texture is very real, all of that kind of thing. Sorry about this. But anyway, once again, a nice example of a freestanding sculpture because once again, we can walk all the way around it. Now that is opposed to, say, relief sculpture. And relief sculpture is a sculpture that is projected from a background surface. And so the most common form of relief sculpture would be that of coins. So if you have any change in your pocket, you have a relief sculpture in your possession. So here you can see an ancient Roman coin. But once again, we have this very slight projection of the image from the background surface. Now, opposed to that, there are two major kinds of relief. And so our first would be low or base relief. And that's what most coins would fall under, that kind of category. But this refers to a sculpture with a slight projection from the surface with minimal shadowing. So here we can see a nice example coming out of ancient Mesopotamia. This is what's known as a Lamassu Gate from Dur-Shuriken. This is the capital of the Assyrian king Sargon II, arguably the most powerful Assyrian king, the founder of its the empire and everything like that. But these would have originally, it would have had another one in association with it, and they would have been situated on either side of a gateway into the city. And these act as a kind of protection-like figure within the mythology of ancient Mesopotamia. So you see them used quite a bit, even into Persian aesthetic in what is modern day Iran and places like that. But we can see that the highest level of relief from the surface, the background surface, is basically just that slight projection of the figure's stomach there and maybe parts of the face. But this is meant to represent a kind of mythological hybrid figure. So we have like a man or it's like part bull, part man, part eagle. So kind of griffin-like, if you will. But once again, these are massive in scale. These are probably a good 15, 20 feet tall. So they would have been, massive in your face when you entered into the city, when, they would have greeted you as you entered and all of that. And it would have been overwhelming. It would have been a symbol of the ruler's power, the power of the kingdom, and all of these kinds of ideas. However, we also have other forms of relief sculpture. Low relief sculpture is very common across the entire world, no matter where we are, what time period, all of that. This time coming out of ancient Persia. This is coming from the Persian capital of Persepolis in modern-day Iran. But what we see here is an interesting motif in Persian aesthetic, something that you'll see quite a bit, even going into like Islamic art from the Persian region. But what we see is a symbolic motif that is meant to represent Persia's view of itself. And so what we see is a lion devouring a bull. And the bull here is meant to represent the earth. And the lion is meant to represent the sun. And likewise, the lion is also meant to represent Persia. And so this motif, which you see quite a bit of, is usually used to highlight this idea that the Persians see themselves as the rulers of the world. And this is really kind of true for a certain time in ancient times, because up until Alexander the Great, the Persians ruled the largest empire that had ever been up to that point. And so once again, they basically ruled the known world as they knew it. But once again, this is something you'll see quite a bit of, even in Mesopotamian art. Many of the kings depict themselves kind of, over life size, and they're like holding a lion with one arm to show their kingly power and all of these kinds of ideas. But once again, we can see base low relief, very slight projection from that background surface. But once again, very, very common. Here we see an example coming out of the Borobudur temple in Indonesia, but this is a scene that is related to the life of Siddhartha. Siddhartha is the individual who becomes the Buddha, like the Buddha. And so what we see depicted here is the moment in which Siddhartha is ritualistically cleansing himself in order to become an ascetic hermit, thus beginning his journey towards enlightenment. So we can see he's stripped off all of his, fancy clothing. He's standing, being bathed by these kind of heavenly figures and whatnot. We can see that he's standing on a lotus blossom. Once again, the lotus blossom being symbolic of Siddhartha himself, but also of enlightenment and all of these kinds of things. But once again, we can see that it's fairly low relief in this regard as well. However, this is opposed to, say, high relief. And high relief is a sculpture with more than half of the natural circumference of the modeled form projected from the surrounding surface area. And so here we can see probably the largest example of high relief sculpture in the world. This is the Temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel in Upper Egypt, or southern Egypt. And this was built along the edge of the Nile to commemorate Ramses' victory over the Hittite Empire of Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey. And so this was situated at the kind of southern end of the Nile, at the edge of the Egyptian Empire, so that anyone traveling up the Nile would be greeted by it, and they would be able to see, Ramses is massively powerful. In life, Ramses was a living god to the Egyptian people. So, his power was unquestionable. And so this is meant to be a symbolic link to that whole idea for anyone traveling into the kingdom. But it also would have served a religious purpose, honoring, Ramses' deification and all of this kind of idea. And we'll see this a little bit more when we talk about ancient Egypt a little later on too. However, we can also have a kind of blend between the two. Here we can see a frieze of members of the imperial family from the Aurapraxis, or the Altar of Peace of Augustus. And so we actually have a nice blend of high relief and low relief. So our child figures here in the foreground are in high relief, even a few of these kind of guys in the middle. But we even have, like in the faces in these background figures, is more of a low relief. So we can blend the two to create a more naturalistic, realistic effect. But once again, this is an altar that was used to make offerings to the cult of the Roman emperor's deity like form. So once again, all Roman citizens would have to make an offering at one of these kinds of temples by law and everything like that. But once again, a nice example of high relief there, but with a mixture. But once again, high relief is very, very common all throughout the world. Here we can see an example from Moissac Abbey coming out of the 12th century in France. But very typical of the kind of Romanesque and early Gothic kind of style. This is what's known as a portal of majesty. So this is the kind of entryway into a major cathedral. But what we see here is actually a kind of Last Judgment-esque scene. So we see Christ enthroned in heaven. So, kind of echoing this idea of him being the ruler of the universe, if you will. We can see that he is surrounded by the four seraphim, the highest order of angels. And then likewise, he's surrounded by the 12 apostles and other holy figures. And I believe that there are also a few earthly kings who were responsible for, commissioning this work as well. But generally speaking, we have a very high relief, as the majority of the sculptural figures are projected almost completely from that background. But once again, this is something that's used all the time. Here we see an interesting example coming out of late 18th, early 19th century France again. So this is the pediment of the Last Judgment from La Madeleine Cathedral. I believe this is in Paris. But once again, this is very similar to our last example. However, this is also a last judgment scene, so we see the faithful on the left being taken into the warm embrace of heaven, and the damned being cast into hell on the right there. However, this is very heavily referencing the idea of pediments coming out of Greco-Roman temples. So if we went to the Parthenon in Athens back in ancient times before it was kind of became a ruin, we would have seen an image like this on the top of the temple, although it would have been dedicated to Athena, the deity of the Parthenon, versus say of Jesus, who we see here in the center here and whatnot. But once again, it's an interesting kind of homage to not only Christianity but this kind of classical antiquity as well. But once again, it shows high relief, very very common, very ubiquitous across all time and place. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the methods and materials of sculpture. So traditionally, sculpture is made by either modeling, casting, carving, constructing, assembling, or some combination of these. So we'll see examples of all of these different kinds of sculpture. So our most basic form is modeling, and modeling is an additive process in which clay, wax, or plaster is built up, removed, or pushed into its final form. And what's interesting about modeling is that it's almost like the kind of sketch of sculpture. So many artists will actually they'll do a bunch of drawings and things like that. In this case, we can see that the artist is using photographic references instead of drawing references. But then they would use those to start modeling in clay, which is very pliable, very easy to use. We then might use this as a base to make a cast on for something like bronze, or we might use it to take measurements off of to then carve the form out of marble or something like that. So modeling really is kind of the birthplace of a lot of sculpture, if you will. Not all artists do this, but many do. It's also a way that many artists learn how to sculpt when you're in school and everything like that. So part of modeling is also using an armature, and an armature refers to a framework or skeleton on which additive sculpture is built. So it adds support, especially for larger things. If we've got a lot of clay, it tends to become brittle and heavy the more you use. And so this armature kind of acts as a skeleton to help hold it together. And so here we can see an example of how an armature might be used. This is a fairly typical kind of assignment that you might do if you were in a sculpture program, especially very traditional sculpture program. And so you'd be, working through human anatomy and everything like that in a sculptural form. But once again, this is all made out of clay around that metal, kind of wire armature there. Now, what I find interesting about modeling is, once again, usually it's used as a kind of preparatory method for a sculpture that might be rendered in a different material later, but it can be used in and of itself. Here we can see an example of one that was never, kind of completed into something different. It was just left as a kind of modeled form here. But here we can see this is Jean-Baptiste Couperou's portrait of the artist's brother. But it also illustrates another aspect of a lot of portraiture from the past, in which we might have a person depicted with attributes associated with them. So the artist was obviously a sculptor, but his brother was a musician, and things like that. But we can also, once again, have modeled forms that are meant to be finished works of art in and of themselves. So here we can see an example of a Sogdian man, which is a kind of Eastern Iranian ethnic group, but it's coming out of the Tang Dynasty in China during the 8th century. But so this would be related to someone that the Chinese people would have interacted with through trade along the Silk Road and things like this. It's also thought, I believe this was meant to be a kind of tomb effigy. So it would be a figurine buried in a tomb with a prominent individual to kind of, act as their servant in the afterlife and things like that. But this would have originally been very heavily painted. And in fact, a lot of sculpture from the past was very elaborately painted, unlike we tend to see it today, and we'll get more into that later too. But once again, this was meant to be a finished work in of itself, whereas this particular image would have probably been originally intended to be a model for a work in marble or in bronze or something that was just never fully realized. However, we can also, once again, have these modeled forms that serve more of sketches, if you will. So here we can see such a sketch. This is by Giambologna. This is a sketch of a river god, which was used to inform a major fountain in Rome. So the actual fountain has a form very reminiscent to this, being an allegorical kind of river deity from classical mythology, but it's fully, carved out of marble instead. But we can see here, and it's very quick, it's very loose, but the artist is, kind of quickly working through his ideas about how the form should be. And this would serve as a model for the later, more finished work as well. Now, aside from modeling, we also have a technique called casting. And casting is a process whereby a sculpture can be made in a pliable medium and then reproduced in a medium with greater longevity, such as bronze. So usually casting, we would start off by creating something in clay or in a wax-like material, and then we would create a cast around it that we could then pour molten bronze into and create multiples of. So just a little breakdown of this process. And once again, this has been used since ancient times as well. But here we can see our sculpture made in a specific type of wax, which is specifically made for this. But we can also see that there's been the addition of this wax kind of spout placed in this as well. And this will act as a pour spout for pouring the bronze into later. Now from here, what we would do is we would then create a system of sprues, which are these kind of little spindly things here. And this would be, used to help create, airflow within the plaster mold that we made around it, which helps air escape while we pour molten bronze in. And it helps to, create a much more, kind of a successful sculpture that's solid and it's not pitted or anything like that from air bubbles and stuff. But once we have all that made, we would then go about the creation of this kind of plaster cast around the outside. And we would do this by dipping our sculpture in this rather kind of nasty looking fluid. It is this color green. And then we would dip it into silica sand, and then at various, kind of grades going from fine to coarse, until we had this large scale cast made up of this kind of material mixed with these various kinds of sand. Now from there, we would then place our whole cast into a kiln, and we would burn off all of this wax, melt it out, and we would be left with a hollow cast from which we could then pour molten bronze into from here. Now after that, we would then break all of the cast off, and we would be left with something like that. So we can see our sculpture here, and then we can see our sprue work, which helped to, let molten metal go to all parts of it, as well as allow air to escape. But then we would cut off, all this excess stuff. We would then polish the metal up however we wanted, and then et cetera, until we're left with the finished product. And it's important to note that, once again, casting has been done since ancient times. Here we can see a bronze sculpture of what's known as the Seleucid Prince. This would be a Greek prince from one of the Greek city-states in modern-day Turkey. But this is possibly Attalus II of Pergamon, one of the major kind of, political entities in that region at the time between the 3rd and 2nd century BCE. But it is important to note that this would not have been cast as one single piece. In fact, many of these kinds of bronzes were cast in multiple pieces and then joined together later. So his head would have been done separately, each of his limbs, his torso, etc., and then they would have all been brought together. And so this is kind of remarkable because there are certain challenges associated with that. But it's also important to note that most classical sculpture, like we see here, would have been painted originally, even if it was bronze. But this is also a kind of sculpture that's very much reserved for specific individuals. And these individuals would be deities or heroes. And hero in this case is kind of a loose term. You would usually be immortalized in bronze if you won the Olympic Games. Rather than having like a medal or something, you would be a statue would be made of you. They also tend to represent, people who's, died gloriously in battle, all kinds of things like that. But most Greek sculpture in particular is also always going to be depicting people nude, specifically the male form. So very, very common there. But once again, it's not just humans that we can do with this. We can do all manner of different bronze work. Here you can see the very famous equestrian statue of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. If you ever saw the movie Gladiator, they recreate this statue in that. But here we can see the original on display in Rome there. Where it would have been originally situated, but we can see once again we have a full scale, horse and figure of Marcus Aurelius there. We can also see he's making that kind of dictatorial stance to show his kind of kingship and his prowess and whatnot. But this would have originally been situated in a public forum. I believe it was originally very close to where the Colosseum is. But all of these kinds of things. But once again, every part of this would have been done separately: the horse's head, its legs, its body, and all of these things joined together later on. But we do have a lot of, examples of bronze sculpture work. In fact, most sculptures you've probably ever seen outside are going to be bronze. The Statue of Liberty is made out of bronze. Here we can see one of the most famous examples. This is Auguste Rodin's The Thinker. So he not only worked in marble, but also bronze as well. It has a very kind of nice longevity in that it doesn't rust or anything. It does oxidize, which makes it turn green, but it won't get eaten through or anything like that, unless we're talking about long periods of time. But once again, it's bronze work is used a lot for outdoor sculpture and things like that. Now, aside from casting, we also have carving, which is our other major form of sculpture. And so this is a subtractive process by which unwanted material is gradually removed. And we would do this through a series of very coarse to very fine tools. And so here we can see a little bit of a breakdown of that. We would start with a rough cut stone that was roughly hewn into the basic shape that we would want. And then we would take a variety of different chisels going from rough to gradually more refined. And we would gradually chip away that excess material and begin to, polish the form. We would then start to use sandpapers and other things to gradually polish it until we got our final form that we see here. So this can be a very, laborious process. Once again, it's very time consuming and, it takes a lot of skill and mastery to do. But we can also recreate carved forms just based on certain measurements and other things like that. So there are tricks that make it a little easier. However, we don't always have to just carve out of stone. A lot of artists also carve out of wood. This is a piece I actually got to see in person a few years ago in Regensburg, Rothenburg in Germany. But this is a scene of the Last Supper, but this is all entirely carved out of one single piece of wood. And so if you see, all of this kind of ornate detail up on the top here, that's all one piece of wood. So wood, obviously, a lot easier to carve than stone, but the fact that they're able to get this much detail in this is quite remarkable, in my opinion. But many artists do things like this. Here we can see this is Zhang Chunhai, after a painting that's called Along the River During the Qingming Festival by an artist known as Zhang Zhendong. So this was originally a scroll painting, an ink painting, but this Chinese artist recreated that ink painting in the trunk of this massive tree. And it's important to note when I show you this detail here in a second that all of this that you see is carved from one single piece of wood. It's not glued, it's not stuff glued on afterwards. So if we look here, we can see all these little individual people. All of these are part of that wood. They're not carved separately and glued on. It is all one piece of wood. So quite remarkable. It took him, I believe, 4 years to actually carve this, this whole thing. But once again, quite remarkable if we're willing to spend the time and the patience on it. However, We also do have very large, grandiose styles of carving, and here we can see one of the largest carved statues in the world. This is the Great Sphinx at Giza. You might ask yourself, well, why does it look like there are bricks here? This is all later restoration work that's been done, but the main actual body of the entire sculpture is carved from solid limestone bedrock on the Giza Plateau. But what's interesting about this, there's a lot of debate about it, about when it was originally created. For Egyptian aesthetic, or as far as Egyptian aesthetic is speaking, the head of it is really small compared to the body, especially when we look at other Sphinx sculptures. So it's thought that this might have actually been a sculpture of a lion at one time, and that when they started building the Great Pyramids, that they came and recarved the lion's head into the face of Khufu or Menkaure there. But that's a little beside the point. A lot of this is also speculated because of this enclosure around it, which shows signs of water erosion. And between 10,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert was actually much more akin to a tropical rainforest, and it's over time that it becomes a desert and everything like that. So it's thought that this monument might be older than we think. But there's a lot of debate because, once again, it's situated with the pyramids. It's also, in the past, it was attested that there was a second one at some point, even though there are no traces of it now. All kinds of things like this. For much of its history, it was actually buried up to its neck in sand, all kinds of things like that. But once again, it's a nice example of a monumental scale carved sculpture. Now, aside from that, I also like to show this image. This is an unfinished sculpture by Michelangelo, widely considered to be one of the greatest sculptors of all time, especially when it comes to marble carving. In fact, he considered himself to be a sculptor, even though his more well-known works of art are like the paintings in the Sistine Chapel. He hated painting. He hated it so much that he had to be threatened with eternal damnation to actually paint the Sistine ceiling. He wanted to be a sculptor. But what he's famous for saying that he didn't actually carve a sculpture. He said that the work actually existed in the block of marble and that he was merely setting it free. And so I think this really speaks to his level of genius and everything like that. But if we look at this compared to, say, one of his more well-known finished sculptures, this is the sculpture of Moses on the tomb of Pope Julius II. But we can see just what level of quality he was able to achieve. I mean, it has mirror-like finish and all of this kind of stuff. But he's also well known for taking on challenges that other people wouldn't take on. So the sculpture of the David that he's most well known for was actually carved from a flawed block of marble that everyone else was too afraid to even touch. Yet he makes one of the greatest masterpieces of all time out of it. Once again, it just kind of highlights his level of skill there. But another aspect of stone carving, especially, that was a major hallmark and kind of a way that sculptors would show off their skills is work like this. So here we see Giovanni Strazza's the Veiled Virgin. So this is a Virgin Mary, but for many centuries, if you were a sculptor and you wanted to show how good you were, you would do transparency in stone. And so here we can see this is all one solid piece of marble, but it's carved in such a way as to suggest the translucency of a veil cast across the Virgin Mary's face. And this is just mind-blowing. The fact that people are able to do work like this is just beyond mind-blowing, in my opinion. But once again, this would be a way that an artist would advertise their skill set. And they would say, well, I can do anything you want. Look at what I can do here. So it's kind of a way you'll see a lot of work like this, especially up through the 19th century. Now, aside from carving, we also have multimedia kinds of sculpture. And so these usually fall under the realm of assembled or mixed media sculptures. So an assembled sculpture is a sculpture that is assembled from various components. And these can be a myriad of different components. Versus a mixed media sculpture, which is an assemblage sculpture that incorporates a variety of media. Not necessarily 3D, but might also incorporate painting and other things like that. But these are much more associated with the modern day, but they do have kind of antecedents in the past as well. And one such, especially in the realm of assembled and mixed media sculpture, would be what's known as a polychrome sculpture. And here we can see one such example. These are mostly done in Spain, and they're mostly done for religious sculptures. But they're quite common in many parts in Europe as well. But here we can see one such. This is Saint Gaines de la Jara. This is actually a work that's incorporating multiple pieces of carved wood along with gold and painting and everything like that. So if we look, we can actually see how the sculpture is created. So it's actually kind of cobbled together from a variety of individually kind of carved pieces. So each hand is carved separately. The kind of parts of the robe are all carved separately and then attached to this kind of interior box and everything like that. But once the carving is actually made, it would go through this whole elaborate process of polychrome painting. And so if we look here on the robes, what they would do, we'd have the raw wood. We would then go through a series of gessoing it. We would then apply an adhesive and gold leaf that adhesive. From there, we would then put another layer of gesso over the gold and then paint it in this dark color. We would then scratch out of that dark, revealing the gold underneath in the pattern here. And then from there, we would then go in and add little bits of extra paint to create the shadows and things like that to create an overall realistic effect. And likewise, with the skin, we would go through a process of gessoing and then underpainting and overpainting to create this very realistic effect. But here we can also see an aspect of how that scumbling would work in painting, and that the artist has painted the veins blue, and then they've kind of put this semi-translucent film of color over top, which starts to imply the way, you know, we can see through our skin somewhat and everything like that. But we could consider this a multimedia form of sculpture because it's carving, it's gold leafing, it's painting, it's all kinds of stuff. But we also have artists that are doing this much more commonly in the modern day. One such artist is Louise Nevelson. She's very famous mid-century modernist artist from the 20th century. But she does a lot of these large-scale assemblage sculptures such as we see here. She often refers to these as sky cathedrals, but what she would do is she would go walk around New York City and she would pick up trash, and so broken pieces of furniture, old crates, all kinds of stuff like that. And she would arrange these objects in those crates and then paint them all solid colors so as not to distract, or so we as the viewer wouldn't be distracted by, you know, oh, well, that's a table leg or something. But instead, it begins to create a commonality and continuity between all of the objects. And so we can view them more for their aesthetically pleasing attributes rather than what they literally are and things like that. So kind of interesting there. But more contemporary example of this, these are some of my favorite artists as well. This is actually I believe a husband and wife couple. This is Sue Webster and Tim Noble, but this is their piece Dirty White Trash. And all of their works are like this, in which they take, you know, like taxidermy, like, you know, pelicans here, and a bunch of just trash and all kinds of other junk, and they arrange them in such a way that when a spotlight is put on it, it creates this very realistic silhouette in the background. And this is another one of those things that, like, first time I saw, like, oh my God, how the hell did they do that? I wish I knew how they did that. I would love to see how they actually go about doing, like, making this. But once again, kind of interesting, non-traditional form of assembled sculpture. Now, aside from that, we can also have things like kinetic sculpture, and that is a sculpture that moves. So it moves in some way. And here we can see this is Santiago Caltavara's Wave. This is actually in Dallas outside of the Art Museum on the SMU campus. Over there, so you can go see this if you want, but it doesn't do it justice in the still image. But if you go there in person, each one of these bronze bars kind of rocks back and forth like a teeter-totter, but it creates this kind of undulating wave effect that is echoed by the reflecting pool underneath. It's kind of cool to actually see in person. I recommend that you guys do that. But likewise, one of the other more famous, artists to deal with kinetic sculpture is Alexander Calder, and he does a lot of these large-scale mobile kinds of sculptures. And these are interesting because they embrace non-traditional sculptural materials. They embrace very modern industrial kinds of materials, so sheet metal and things like that. But he creates these large scale things, and they're very meticulously balanced. But because of that, they have this fluid movement. So you're never going to see one quite the same way twice, because every time you see one, it's going to be subtly different. It's going to be in a different position. If there's any kind of breeze around it, it's going to change dramatically, and all kinds of things like that. But this is what gives it that kinetic kind of quality. Now, aside from that, we also have installation kinds of sculpture. And so installation is when a space in which objects are brought together for symbolic significance are used. And it's important to note that usually when artists are creating things like installations, they're also assuming that we, the viewer, are part of the sculpture as well. So it's basically like creating an encompassing environment, if you will, that we can go into and interact with, and thus become part of the artwork itself. So here we can see one such installation. This is Nancy Rubin's Our Friend Fluid Metal. And so what she's done is she's creating these large kind of fluid undulating forms out of, kind of mundane objects. In fact, it's all completely made out of those old, like those little animal teeter-totters that you see on playgrounds. But once again, it's all connected with, wire and rebar and other things. So it's kind of an interesting thing, but it creates this kind of large scale environment that we can interact with, walk through, all of these kinds of things. Similarly, we also have, other types of installations, such as Cornelia Parker here. This is Cold Dark Matter, an exploded view. This is a found object sculpture. So like Louise Nevelson, she's going and just finding, trash and discarded stuff. But she's kind of suspended all of these objects from this grid on the ceiling by fishing wire to look as though we're seeing like a building exploding from the inside out, but we've like stopped time. And so this is very cool. Once again, this is one of those things that I really wish I knew how they kind of went about doing some of it, just to create the overall effect. But what I think is interesting about this particular work as well is that we, the viewer, are meant to be part of it as well. But it's not just the physical sculptural object that we see here, it's also the reflection of those objects from the light emanating out of the middle, which creates part of the environment as well. So in this sense, the shadow and the light is actually part of the sculpture in that regard at the same time. So that's kind of an interesting feature as well. Now, one of my favorite forms of, installation artwork is when the artist physically alters the actual physical space of a gallery. And I always love things like this by Henrique Oliveira. I love when they manipulate things like the drywall and concrete within the gallery setting to, look as though things are growing up out of it in these unnatural ways. And it just seems to kind of blend all seamless and everything. But I love work like this because it also kind of plays with our perception of reality and all kinds of stuff like that. There's another, I believe the same artist also does a lot of these kinds of wooden sculptural forms where he'll take like an old school grandfather clock and make it look as though he's stretched it out and then tied it in a knot, but it's all just, a piece of wood and everything. But it's fairly interesting there. Now, in addition to in installation works, we also have what's known as site-specific works. And this is an installation that's intended only for one particular location. So many of the other location or installations that we saw could actually be transplanted to different, locations and everything like that. So, we could view them multiple times. However, site-specific works such as Cloud Gate by Anish Kapoor here, was only ever meant for this specific location in Chicago. And I believe it overlooks one of the Great Lakes. But if you go there, once again, it's considered an installation because you can interact with it, you can walk through it. A lot of people go and take their pictures in it because it has this kind of fun house mirror like effect. Some of you guys might have been there, might have seen it, things like that. But once again, this is meant for one specific location. Now, similarly, one of the other more prominent site-specific artists is also a husband and wife team, and this is Jean-Claude and Christo. And I believe Jean-Claude is still alive. I think Christo died a few years ago, but they made their career of going and covering things in fabric. So here we can see one. This is the Valley Curtain at Rifle Gap, Colorado in 1972, but they actually, span this entire valley with this large scale curtain, and they do other wild things. We have some other examples here in a second. But what I think is interesting about this type of installation and site specific work is that it's a really collaborative kind of effort. So Jean-Claude and Christo themselves are the artists that come up with a concept for it. They would do a lot of drawing and stuff like that to help raise money to put it on, but then they would actually go and hire, huge numbers of people to actually physically make or implement these things in various places. They've done many of these kinds of things across the span of like 30, 40 years, and we'll see some more examples of that, even further on. But just another example, between 1980 and 1983, they surrounded all of these small islands in Miami Harbor with these large pink sheets that were, floated out a certain distance and anchored to stay in place. But what I also find interesting about their work is that it's all meant to be temporary. So all of their work will only stay up for, a few years or maybe even just a few weeks or months at a time, and then it's just completely destroyed. So part of it is not only being specific to the location where it's at, but it's also, this kind of fleeting, ephemeral kind of aspect, in that we have to go interact with it in the moment to be able to see it, because otherwise all we get are photographs of it. Now, aside from site-specific works, we also have what's known as earthenworks, and these are site-specific works created outdoors. So just because something is site-specific doesn't necessarily mean that it's happening outside, but earthworks are exclusively outside, and they're usually going to be using natural materials to either enhance the landscape or echo it in some way, and things like that. But they usually also have antecedents with the land art of ancient peoples, specifically like the ancient Hopewell culture in North America built a lot of these large-scale animal mounds in various places and things like that. But one of the more well-known earthwork artists is Robert Smithson, and this is probably his most well-known piece. This is the Spiral Jetty in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And this is a piece that's meant to echo the landscape. It's not meant to alter it necessarily, but it's meant to give it a little bit of a general flair. But what's interesting is that, we can never see Spiral Jetty the same way twice, because sometimes it's completely submerged underwater and you can't see it. Other times it's exposed like we see here. You can actually walk out onto it. At various points it's had these, nice salt buildups which make it appear very white. And in this case, there's also an algae bloom around it, which makes the water appear pink. So it gives it a nice contrast and things like that. But kind of interesting there. But once again, it's meant to echo the landscape more than anything. But a lot of these earthenworks, once again, they reference many of the earthworks of ancient peoples. Here we can see one of the more famous examples. This is one of the Nazca lines in Peru. And what's interesting is these were not discovered until the early 20th century, when someone flew over this area for the first time in an airplane. Because if you're on the ground, you actually can't really see them. But don't be fooled by the Ancient Aliens people on the History Channel. These were not created by aliens. We know exactly how they were made and exactly how they were used. And so these are actually actually made by simply pushing aside rocks on the surface of this plateau. So all of the dark area you see is like loose gravel and stuff on the surface, and where the line is, it's just been pushed aside to reveal the surface itself. And because this area of Peru is very arid and it receives almost no rainfall, many of these lines have remained intact for several hundred years. In fact, we could go and make some of these ourselves, and they would probably last for a long time. But what's interesting is that many of them depict animal forms, such as we see. Some of them are abstract, and others are geometric. Some of the straight lines, like the ones we see cutting through here, actually extend upwards of 10 miles. But it's known that these were used for ritualistic processions. So this is an area where the native peoples of this area are trying to grow agriculture in a desert, and so water is very important to them. So these would be used in ritual processions where people would walk along the lines and they would chant and sing songs, say prayers, and all of this kind of stuff in the placation of the deities for water. And in fact, they're also well known for their cistern systems and irrigation and things like that. But this is probably what captures most people's attention about them. But the Nazca lines, once again, they're a variety of different things. So the last one was a bird. Here we can see what's thought to be a spider. We can see some more of those geometric ones up top there and everything like that. So, moving on to craft media. Craft media often is kind of associated with sculpture in that it's usually more 3D. However, craft and the world of fine art have had a very kind of tumultuous period. So craft tends to fall a little bit in between folk art and fine art. It usually has more of a utilitarian function, all different kinds of things like that. But there is a lot more recognition of craft art forms nowadays as being fine art material. Whereas in the past it was kind of relegated to other, like, oh, that's lesser or whatnot. But that's not to downplay it. It's just, once again, times change and whatnot. So in the West, there has often been a separation of art and craft. Art might be highly crafted, but is often not useful. Simultaneously, utility items might be functional, but they're not artworks. And so craft kind of falls into a weird place in between. So each of these are considered works of craft. However, they're not always each considered works of art. But for much of its history, artisans were considered craftsmen. Think about our discussion of the guild system a while back, until basically the Renaissance, when people become individually known, they're really considered craftsmen above all else. So craft itself refers to an artwork that serves a utilitarian purpose. So kind of like folk art, but once again, there's a little bit of a distinction between the two. Craft usually tends to be a little on the higher end of, like someone who knows what they're doing versus folk art, which is a little bit more on the naive outsider level, these kinds of things. But many artists blur the line between art and craft. Functionality and unfunctionality. So especially nowadays, there's a lot of interplay there. But media generally associated with craft would be things like clay, glass, metal, wood, and fiber. And so we'll see some examples. So first and foremost, we have clay, which is soil with a highly volcanic makeup that is mixed with water. And so pretty basic. But any arts that we make with clay are going to be considered ceramics. So that is the art and science of making things with clay refers to ceramics. Now, a ceramicist is a person who works with clay, whereas a potter is a ceramicist who specializes in dishware. So there's an important distinction here. If you're a ceramicist, you might be making all kinds of different things out of clay, whereas a potter is going to be making dishware out of clay. But when we are making things out of clay, we also have to use what's known as a kiln. And a kiln is a dedicated high temperature oven used for firing ceramics. And this is something that not only hardens the ceramics, but it also can make them waterproof and usable for a variety of different things. So here we can see a kiln that's loaded up with ceramic pieces to be fired. And so when we put something in the kiln, what we're doing is firing it. And this is a process by which ceramics are baked and thus hardened. And so clay itself is really categorized by three broad types. We have earthenware, stoneware, and porcelain. And so we'll see examples. So earthenware refers to a ceramic that is fired at a relatively low temperature between 800 and 1100 degrees Celsius and is porous after firing. And it's the most common ceramic form throughout history. So terracotta, such as we see here, is a form of earthenware. And so a lot of the clay kind of molding figures that we saw, modeling figures that we saw earlier on, those are all going to be earthenware. If you've ever seen like Greek vases and things like that, that's all earthenware. And we'll see some examples of that as well later on. So here we can see an example of an earthenware vessel from ancient Greece. This is what's known as a calyx. It's a kind of serving tray, but usually we have the addition of a glaze that would then give some kind of imagery to these vessels and things like that. They're usually mythological in origin, all kinds of stuff like this. But once again, very, very common. Now this is supposed to say stoneware. And stoneware is a heavy ceramic material that is fired at higher temperatures between 12 and 1300 degrees Celsius, which is not porous and is the most common form of ceramic today. So this is stoneware is most usually used in like dishware and stuff like that. So if you have plates that aren't like paper or plastic at home, I guarantee that they're going to be stoneware. But the interesting thing with that, here we can see a nice example from the 1850s. We can impart all kinds of decorative designs on them, glaze work, all kinds of different things. So the possibilities are really endless with it. Now, aside from stoneware, we also have porcelain, and this is the most rare and expensive form of clay. It's made from deposits of granite, which become white and non-porous after firing at very high temperatures between 13 and 1400 degrees Celsius. So porcelain is very rare. It's originated in China originally, and China dominated the porcelain world until roughly the 1600s when the technology made its way to Europe. But porcelain is very interesting. The Chinese actually consider it to be magical in that if you strike porcelain, if you were to flick it, it actually rings. So they considered it in ancient times to have or to contain music. And so it's usually reserved for the royalty of China and the high-ups. It's also very heavily characterized by this blue and white appearance. The porcelain itself is white, but at the time, the only glaze color that could withstand the high temperatures associated with it was this blue glaze. So most porcelain from China and before the 19th century in general is going to have this like nice blue and white kind of pattern. And we'll see some more examples of that when we talk about Asia as well. Now, when we're making ceramic ware, there are a few types of ways that we can go about making it. One such way would be molding, and this is an additive and subtractive process whereby clay is pressed into a pre-existing form. So a lot of the ceramic material that we have today is made this way. So if you go buy like a ceramic teapot at like Walmart or whatnot, I guarantee it was probably made in this fashion. Versus, say, the traditional way of making clay, which is throwing or throwing on the wheel. And this is when we shape clay on a rapidly rotating wheel, such as we see here. And this is a very interesting technique. It's very challenging to learn, but once you learn it, it's quick. It's almost magical to watch. I've never been good at it myself, but you put a lump of raw clay in the middle, and then you wet your hand and you basically push and pull into it, and it's just like in the matter of a few seconds, like whoop, there's a vase. Once you know how to do it, it's really, really crazy. And in fact, if you guys are interested, we have a ceramics program at TCU or TCC, which can teach you how to do this, quite well. I've always been jealous of my friends who know how to do this. I can't throw for hell. But once again, this is the traditional way that most clay pots and things were made, aside from, physically building it like a pinch pot or something like that. Now, usually also when we make a ceramic ware, we will apply glaze to it. And this is different than glazing in, say, painting, in that A glaze in ceramics is a liquid silica-based paint that is used to shellac ceramic ware. So this not only helps to protect it, but it also helps to make it waterproof and everything like that. But depending on what types of glaze we use, such as we can see here, we can make all kinds of different, patterns, colors, textures, what have you. The possibilities are really endless. But it's because glaze is silica based, it actually, once it's fired, kind of becomes glass on the exterior. So it takes on that kind of glass like sheen as well. But here we can see just how crazy glaze work can be. Here we have another example of porcelain, coming out of China. But once again, we can be very elaborate in how we glaze it, or we can be more abstract, such as we see here, everything like that. We'll see when we talk about Islamic art, they develop what's known as lusterware, which imparts a metallic kind of sheen to the glazed surface and everything like that. So we'll see more examples of that later on. Now, aside from ceramic ware, one of our other major craft mediums is glass. So glass has been used for at least 4,000 years, predominantly for containers. Here we see an example of Roman glass. This is what's known as a cage cup. The fact that this survives to this day is just beyond remarkable. But once again, in terms of craft, a lot of what we think of in glasswork is going to be more sculptural, especially in the modern day, guys like Dave Chihuly and whatnot. But in the past, it was usually in the realm of stained glass, which is quite extensively used in church architecture and everything like that throughout the Middle Ages. Even today, it's fairly popular. But here we can see a nice example of stained glass from the 13th century. Stained glass is actually kind of dangerous to make because it's all joined with lead, and so a lot of stained glass workers would actually go insane and everything like that. And we'll see a picture of that in a minute. But here we can see the typical idea. Some of this glass would be all hand blown and hand cut. And then, aspects of it, like the faces in this sense, would be hand painted as well. So it's very laborious. It's all made through small pieces like mosaic work and things like that. So this was the predominant use of glass for many, many centuries. But nowadays, we also have, guys like Dave Chihuly, who I just mentioned, who do much more, kind of elaborate and abstract glass sculpture works. So I like a lot of these kind of works by him where he does these big glass tubes. He's an interesting guy. He actually lost one of his eyes many years ago, and so he has no depth perception now. So he actually employs a large team of people to blow glass for him. And there's a documentary you can watch, and you can see how he does it. But he sits there and like barks orders at him, like blow it, stop, turn it. It's just stuff like that. But once again, he creates these very, very elaborate, large-scale kind of sculptural installations. If you've ever been to Las Vegas, I think it's either Caesar's Palace or the Bellagio has a lot of his glass work in there and everything like that. But just another picture of stained glass here so we can see that lead solder, so every individual piece of glass would be hand cut and fitted like this. So once again, very dangerous. It's very easy to cut yourself. And once again, working with lead of any kind is always going to be problematic and everything like that. Now, aside from that, one of our other major craft materials is metal. And metal in the craft world is mostly relegated to things like jewelry. So we don't really need to talk about a whole lot of that. However, we do have nice examples such as the death mask of Tutankhamun here. This is completely made out of 18 karat gold with precious stone inlay. In fact, all of this blue stone that you see here, this is lapis lazuli, which comes from Afghanistan. So it shows that the Egyptians were trading quite extensively. This is also the mineral that's used to make the color ultramarine blue. But once again, this is all hand hammered and hand polished. So this is a lump of gold would be formed over a wooden model that would have been carved, and they would have hammered it out very thin over the top of that model to create this, and then they would press, kind of make indentions for that precious stone. But aside from things like jewelry and works like this, the other major form of metal working in the realm of craft would be things like arms and armor. So here we can see one of the more interesting aspects of that, in my opinion. This is what's known as the Ulfbard swords, and this is a very unique Viking sword in that this sword was 1,000 years more advanced than anything else in Europe at the time. And so this is basically because of the Vikings' vast exploration. It's known that they traveled as far as North America 500 years before Columbus supposedly did, even though he only landed in the Caribbean. But they also traveled as far as Baghdad in the Middle East, and they picked up the technology for what was known as Damascus steel. And this is something that's been lost to us today. But Damascus steel and these Ulfbard swords were thought to have magical properties because you could bend one of these swords totally in half, let go of it, and it would snap back straight without breaking. You could also, at the time, take one of these swords and cut an iron sword in half with it without even messing up this. So if you had one of these on a Viking battlefield, you were a very important individual, and you would also be seen as, having, wielding magical powers. It's also interesting that to harden the steel, they would use carbon and from charcoal, but you can make charcoal from more than just wood. So many times they would use the bones of their fallen enemies or the bones of like animals like wolves or bears or something to imbue the spirit of those people or animals into the sword as well. So this is thought to take on this magical property as well. But we know that these are Ulfbard swords because every Ulfbard sword has the name inlaid into the blade there. And this is another feature that's quite remarkable considering the time that these are all made in during the 9th to 11th centuries, because this is a very difficult thing to do even today. So the fact that they were doing this in medieval times, and once again that this technology is so far advanced compared to everything else in Europe at the time, is just beyond remarkable. Now, aside from that, we also have fiber arts. And so fiber arts are, include things like weaving, stitching, basket making, surface design such as textiles, as well as wearable art. So, any kind of clothing, as well as handmade paper. All of these things could be, considered fiber arts. But generally speaking, fiber arts are considered in two categories: on loom or off loom. And so a loom is a machine that holds warp fibers in place and separates them for the process of weaving. So here we can see a loom, and we would use these foot pedals to sit there and separate our warped and weft fibers in order to create the woven pattern. And what I find interesting is that the very first programmable computer in the 1800s was actually a loom, and it would use these punch cards to separate these warp and weft fibers at certain times to create specific patterns. So this is actually the very first programmable, computer kind of technology, is this loom. Obviously, this one more rudimentary, but once again, it's an interesting aspect of that. So on the loom, we have two types of fibers. Our first would be our warp fiber, and these are long fibers held in place on the loom itself. And then we have the weft fiber, which crosses the warp fibers at right angles to create a lattice work. So if we see a diagram of that, we have our warp fibers here in red and yellow, and our weft here in blue. And depending on how we press down those pedals on the loom, it separates various of these fibers at different times, and then as we run the blue through there, it creates specific patterns in the weaving. So we can be very intricate with this as well. So, we can do all kinds of things with this type of weaving throughout the past. A lot of this was done to do tapestries, which was a way to decorate, interiors without making fresco paintings. So you could take the tapestry with you if you ever decide to move around. But here we can see just a nice example of early Renaissance to Renaissance tapestries in general, but we have this kind of unicorn hunt and everything. So dealing with mythical subjects and whatnot. But there are other kinds of fiber arts. This is another one of my favorite contemporary artists. This is Ceci Zavaglia, and this is a portrait of a young girl, but this is entirely embroidery. So this is all done just by, making stitches of colored thread. And what I like about it is her pigtails, actually the artist lets the thread kind of hang off, so it takes on this 3D like feeling to it and gives it more sense of reality. But if we look at a little bit of a close-up, we can see just how intricate it is. You can follow her on Instagram as well. She does a lot of really crazy things, but it's really remarkable to watch her progress on some of them and see how she's doing it. But once again, this stuff I really love, when an artist is able to take a material and make it look as though it's not that material. So I've always enjoyed kind of, really hyper real things like this. But aside from that, we also can use or have fiber arts that break into the world of like street art, kind of like graffiti. This is what's known as yarn bombing, and so a lot of people will make these, kind of cross-stitched or knitted objects, and they'll go cover public sculptures with it. In fact, when I was in undergraduate school at UNT, one of the fiber art majors went over to one of the biology buildings that had all these little animal sculptures, and she knitted little sweaters for every one of them, and that was kind of her project. So this is kind of fun. Once again, it kind of bridges this, kind of non-traditional art form into the realm of like street art and things like that. So I think that's a kind of interesting aspect of it as well. So that ends us off for our discussion of sculpture and fiber. Next time we will start our discussion of art history with the most ancient art forms, and we'll go from there. So thanks for joining me again. We'll see you next time.